Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, how can you beat the social stereotypes that form outside of your own awareness? We're joined by one expert who tells us how and why it matters to business. Plus, China rolls out its national digital currency. All that and our poll next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's March 2nd, and here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. United to furlough 3,000 workers. Cruise bookings soar despite U.S. ban. And digital currency being tested in China. Let's take a deeper look into that story. The People's Bank of China has been developing a digital currency and is one of more than 60 countries to do so. According to the New York Times, if the ECNY is successful, it will give the central bank new powers, including novel types of monetary policy to help the economy grow. Joining us now to discuss this is news editor Jordan Dahl. Jordan, why are they making this move right now?
When it comes to financial markets and services, China is a completely different environment than the US. They bypassed credit cards entirely. They just never took hold and went straight to digital payments. But the companies that are creating these digital payments are all private companies. They are the ones who control consumer data, and the Chinese government wants to take that control back. This will enable them to better influence a monetary policy and have a much better idea on what consumers are spending money on.
Of course, we have digital currencies here in the US as well. Bitcoin comes to mind. How is this different than, say, Bitcoin here in the US?
So Bitcoin is a new, entirely different currency. It is not tied to a central bank or to any particular country. These digital currencies are managed by central banks, and it's the same money that we're used to. In this case, it is Chinese yuan, or it could be American dollars, but they exist in and are used in a digital format. Now, central governments are interested in developing these currencies as a way of moving money faster and cheaper, especially to low-income populations. One use case would be thinking about the stimulus checks. If we had a digital currency in the US, those could be seamlessly transferred to individuals rather than forcing them to wait on a check.
I'm sure there are many members joining us in the stream, given how hectic that outroll of those checks were. Would have loved for something a little bit more seamless. But for those who are joining us and they just don't have access to digital currency, what does a move like this mean for them?
So something that's really important to know is how far ahead China is when it comes to digital payments. Now, we are now familiar with Apple Pay, QR codes, especially since the pandemic began, but these took hold in China back in 2015. And over the course of 6 months, it went from cash being king to everyone's wallet being their cell phone. American companies and other firms took notice and developed products to compete with them. But China is still leading the way, and that extends to digital currencies. But they are not the only country looking to develop them. As you mentioned at the top of the show, more than 60 countries are experimenting with this. This includes Sweden and even the Bahamas. The US lags behind, but they have done some initial research on whether or not they should develop one.
Yeah, you mentioned that there are some benefits here, right, of the US developing a digital currency. So why haven't we? Why aren't we exploring this as an option here in the States?
It's a good question. It is being explored, but it's in very, very initial stages of research. And it's sort of the chicken or the egg question. Do you build a product and hope that demand will follow, or do you wait for the demand? Now, most people are not familiar with Apple Pay and other digital payment options, but you have to remember that those were pretty isolated to a few cities in the US, and the majority of the country still relied on credit cards. So this has just not been a high priority for the US. And now with Secretary Janet Yellen focused on economic recovery, it has gotten pushed even further down that list.
We've talked a lot about some of the benefits, Jordan, but with everything new, there's got to be some concerns. What are the concerns, and how is China trying to mitigate some of them?
Absolutely. Anytime that you are talking about data collection and knowing what consumers are spending their money on, you are going to come up against privacy concerns. Right now, private companies control that data. Apple, WeChat, Alipay, and they develop products based on those trends. When a central government has that data, it raises a lot more concerns about human rights and monitoring. And that is certainly the case in China, where there are concerns that they could use this to further crack down on dissidents and other ethnic minorities. China, for its part, says that is not part of their plan, but there is a long track record to suggest otherwise.
Well, Jordan, I'm glad you're stateside with us now, but you used to cover the news in China, and so I appreciate you bringing that perspective for us here on LinkedIn News.
Glad to. Thanks for having me.
That was Jordan Dahl. She's news editor for us here at LinkedIn. And for more stories like these, be sure to check out the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. We've been polling professionals on the LinkedIn news page, and now we want to hear from you too on the poll that we have for you in the stream. It's about unconscious bias. Do you know what unconscious bias looks like in the workplace? A, yes, B, no, or C, I think so. Let us know your vote right now in the stream, but more importantly, I want to hear your thoughts behind your vote so we can have a conversation about that on today's show. Unconscious bias creates many talent gaps within corporate America and beyond, but it happens below one's own awareness and oftentimes instantaneously. So how can you fix the myopia in your own thinking? Joining us now to discuss is Stacey Gordon. She's the author of the book Unbiased. She's also the CEO and Chief Diversity Strategist at Rework Work. Stacey, thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's great to be with you. Stacey, unconscious bias is a big topic. It's a growing topic across the workplace. What don't people still understand about it?
I think one of the things that people don't understand, there's a lot, right? But I think one of the main things is that it can be addressed. There seems to be the thought process that because it's unconscious, then we don't know that we're doing it, so there's really nothing we can do about it. And that could not be further from the truth.
And speaking of that point of there's nothing that we can do about it, how does unconscious bias impact the way that we work? If there's a little bit within a team or within a company, does that make a big difference?
It definitely adds up, right? I mean, there's scales and there's spectrums, and I think what happens is it compounds. So when we are hiring and we're looking at, bringing on a new person to our team, it happens there. We start with the recruiters who look and say, well, I'm not sure if the hiring manager is going to want someone from this school or from this neighborhood or with this, person with this name that sounds like this, right? And we don't say these things out loud. We don't actually say, I am planning to discriminate against this type of person. But it is the way that we are socialized into thinking that certain people belong in certain boxes. And so the goal of this is really to get outside of those boxes that we have traditionally drawn for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, I'm going to go ahead and say hello to some members who are on the stream right now. We have Vicenzio from Italy, Anna from Canada, Victoria from Texas, and Miriam from New York. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live. I'm here with Stacey Gordon for a conversation about the big topic, unconscious bias, which we all encounter at some point when we're in the workplace. Stacey, you talk about socializing and social behavior and proper norms being the reason why we don't say some of the things like you just said in terms of when we're making hiring decisions and the like. But a lot of figuring out what unconscious bias is sitting in the discomfort of, ooh, maybe I am being biased in this moment. So how do you instruct people to sit in that discomfort of, is this a bias that I need to confront?
Yeah, it's, sitting in discomfort is something we want to avoid. Nobody wants to be uncomfortable, right? Nobody wants to feel like they're going to put their foot in their mouth, say something that they might accidentally insult someone or make someone feel bad. So we just don't do it. And I think this is where what we're trying to work against is that socialization, again, where we've been socialized and we've been taught to avoid the discomfort. We've been taught to avoid the tough topics. And what we teach is that the more that you dive in, the more you realize that everyone else is also struggling with these topics. And so we can work on them together and work together as a team instead of everyone being off by themselves, thinking, and making assumptions about what everybody else is thinking.
And unconscious bias rears its ugly head in a multitude of different forms, and you walk through all of them in your LinkedIn Learning course. I want to talk a little bit about affinity bias. So for those who are joining us in the stream, don't know what affinity bias is, walk us through what that is and how it impacts the way that we work.
Yeah, affinity bias is the one that impacts us so easily. And it's that, I always talk about it like that gut feel, right? Have you ever been talking to somebody that you just met and you felt comfortable with them? Why? Because you ended up finding an affinity, right? You ended up finding something that you have in common. You may have found that you went to the same school, or you both have kids that are the same age, or you both enjoy the same, both just recently read the same book. Whatever it is that draws you together creates this bond that then can sometimes override our common sense, right? And our the data that's out there for us. So especially, I always go back to hiring, because we've all interviewed or we've been interviewed, and we know what that's like. And when you're in that process of that hiring process, you feel that, you get that affinity. And so if you're in a place, especially if you're the one that's hiring and you feel that for somebody, you've got to remember that that's a feeling and it's not a fact. The fact is this person qualified for the job? The fact is, does this person have the experience that you need? The fact is, can they do the job that you want them to do? And have you asked the questions that would actually answer that, not going off of this feeling of, oh, I like this person, right? I get them. They get me. They could fit in this culture, right? But that's all feelings. And we've got to really look at the difference between feelings and facts.
And Stacey, I actually thought about you last week when the news came out that Jacinda Brown-Duckett was going to become CEO of TIAA. There are now just 2 Black female CEOs in the Fortune 500. The last one was a decade ago, so having 2 is meaningful progress. But how much of that fact, there's 2 Black female CEOs in the Fortune 500, how much of that is connected directly to affinity bias, to unconscious bias?
Oh, goodness, right? We're in the LinkedIn news network, right? I love LinkedIn. I've worked with LinkedIn for many years, and I was one of the early adopters of LinkedIn. And I think one of the things that even, Jeff Weiner said it, right, is that we like to look at our first connections. We want first connections. When people are in our second or our third connections, or even outside of that, we ignore them. So in order for us we have to broaden our networks. If you're one of those people that when you get a LinkedIn connection request, you look at it and go, well, do I know this person? No, decline. Well, then why are you on LinkedIn, right? The whole point is to open your network. And so to your question, if our networks are more open, we have access to more people. If we have access to more people, we have a broader range of people to potentially work with. And what happens is our networks, as we're in such tiny bubbles, that we are constantly perpetuating and working with people who look like us, who talk like us, who think like us, because again, it comes back to comfort. That's where we're comfortable.
And when Jacinda gets appointed, or I think of Roz Brewer at Walgreens gets appointed, what does that do in terms of revealing some of our own unconscious biases? When we see these headlines in the news, see the numbers that there are so few, does that make some people reflect back on the work that we need to do?
I think it definitely makes us think back on the work we need to do. And it also really makes it stand out, that point that, wow, we have so few. And then it makes them really seem, special, right? Or so magical, or like, why is that so different? And so really our goal has to be to broaden that number. I think McKinsey put out a report just last week that said that it's going to take 95 years for Black professionals to reach parity at the leadership level, which will be getting to 12%. And not like 95 years, we have to do better, right? We can do this faster. And they even said we can do it faster if we open up our networks, if we stop categorizing people, if we stop working off of these biases. So we can do this. It means that we actually have to do the work. And I always ask the question, but do you really want to? Because we say we do, but got to ask the question, do I really want to do this?
I want to get into that work and what that work looks like as opposed to talk. But first, let's open up our networks to some of the members who are joining us on the show right now. We have Moses from Nigeria, Maria from California, Daniel from Haiti, and Christy from Delaware. And I just want to give a quick call out for questions to the members who are joining us in the stream. Unconscious bias, it's a heavy topic that a lot of people don't know what they don't know about. And we have one of the foremost experts on with us the show right now. So if you have questions, please get them into the stream and we'll bring them into the show as well. And Stacey, I see a comment here from Deontay who's bringing up the point is a lot of us are working remote right now and not face-to-face. Are biases exacerbated in this virtual world that a lot of us are living in?
I don't know if they're exacerbated, but they just we keep finding ways to exclude people, right? We keep finding ways for bias to show up. So now we found some new ways. Now we realize, if you look at it, there's a hierarchy, right, of even who gets to work from home and who doesn't. Essential workers versus office workers. There's this dichotomy, and so even when we start, again, I go back to hiring because it's such an easy way for people to visualize what I'm talking about. I've talked to people who said, oh, well, I'm not going to hire someone if they don't have, a proper background. Like, I had to sit here and set up my background, right? It's like, if they don't have a good background, if they don't have a quiet space, if they don't have a dedicated space to work, then why would I hire them? Because they didn't ask to work from home. They're being mandated to work from home. There's a difference. They're not asking for an accommodation, right? They're not asking for something special. We have to really start to think about what are those biases that we put on people when we see that maybe their background looks a little bit different. Maybe it looks a little bit messy. Maybe they've got kids in the background. We immediately make negative assumptions about that person. And now we've made it so much harder for them to get hired.
That I hadn't heard that there are actual employers who are making decisions based on what a background looks like. That's terrifying, especially for someone who's in the work that you're in. So I'm glad that you're doing the work to socialize that is not okay. But Stacey, your book on bias, it's all about moving beyond the talk. I think particularly over the summer, we saw a lot of corporate leaders speaking out against systemic racism, speaking out about unconscious bias. And in your book, it's really you provide a toolkit really for action, moving beyond the words, moving beyond the LinkedIn posts. What are some underleveraged tools that you talk about in your book?
Yeah, a part of it is starting with actually dialing back before we get to action. Because, as you said, last summer, everyone wanted to put up a black square and say Black Lives Matter, and everyone wanted to post a pledge. I challenge every single company that did that to ask, well, what have you done since? The pledge was great, but what happened since? And so what we talk about is really going back to awareness. We're having that conversation and asking, what is happening in your workplace? Have you talked to your employees? People want to come to me and say, Stacey, we want unconscious bias training. I'm like, that's great. I can come in and do it. But is that what you actually need? You don't know that because you haven't done the work yet.
And from my seat as a journalist, talking to a lot of leaders in the space and asking that very question, what have you done since you put this out? I'm getting a lot of this is long-term progress. We're not going to see short-term goals. So are there things in the interim that we can actually track and measure as people are trying to aspire to more equal workplaces in the long term? So when they do say we're working towards it, is there something that's a little bit more, you can hang your hat on a little bit more?
Definitely. And I think this is where, I always hear, and I cringe a little bit because people say, well, diversity and inclusion training doesn't work. And I think that is something we can start with. And I would say, yes, diversity and inclusion training doesn't work if you do it as a one-time action, right? If you only do it for a certain, segment of your population. If I come in and I do this training for you and then you do nothing else afterwards, right? There has to be a plan. So I think diversity and inclusion, and I even hate the word training because I feel like training's for puppies, right? We want education. We need to get together and use our brains to really work harder at this. And we can do it, but it requires commitment. And so one of the first things you can do is some awareness, is some education. And then once you have uncovered what those things are that are happening in your workplace, then you can do the action. Then you can say, yeah, we need to revise our practices, our policies, our procedures, and we need to really start to make a dent in these and change them.
I love that. Well, speaking of that education, we have a question here from Morty who says, what's the goal here? Is the goal to eradicate bias, or is it to just change unconscious bias to conscious bias?
Well, conscious bias ends up being like discrimination, right? So what we actually want is what I coined the phrase, unconscious inclusion. That's what we want to get to. We want to get to a place where instead of us purposely and inadvertently in most times, screening people out of our lives, we want to be including people, right? And screening them in. So that's the goal, is getting to this state of unconscious inclusion. And the way that you get there is through talking to more people and through these small bites, right? We've got to do many intentional things, but the goal is you really can't eradicate bias because that's just how our brains work, but we can interrupt it. right? Before we get ready to open our mouths and say something, we need to stop ourselves and say, is this something I should say? Is this something that is actually going to add to the conversation? Is this something that is necessary, right? I think sometimes you used to ask, like, is this going to be kind, right? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And I get it. It's the workplace. We're not trying to do a woo-woo kumbaya, let's all, hold hands and skip through the daisies together, right? You want to come to work and work, but you also want to come to work and not be bullied. You want to come to work and have the same advantages and the same opportunities for advancement that everybody else has. You want to come to work and be able to know that your work is being valued and that you're being adequately compensated for that work.
And I think that most people who are joining us in the stream can agree that they want all of those things in the workplace as well. But Stacey, I'm going to pose a question to you that you actually posed recently to yourself on LinkedIn, which is, why is inclusion so easy to get wrong? Why are we still so bad at it if we are having these conversations and the intent, hopefully, behind most workers' actions is to be inclusive?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get wrong because we slip into these habits. And I'm going to say this and get mad at me, but we're lazy, right? We are human beings. We are lazy. If there's a path of least resistance, that's the one we're going to take, right? Nobody wants to have to do the extra work. So when I say this doesn't have to be hard, it doesn't, right? But it does take us thinking a little bit more about what we're saying. We get the pushback that, everyone wants you to be politically correct. No one can say anything anymore. That's not true, right? It's not about being politically correct. It's not about watching your mouth, but it is about really thinking about the individuals that you're working with and realizing that we have gone far too long in a state where it was okay to discriminate. And it was okay to be biased against a certain group of people. And we have to really understand that is wrong and that needs to be rectified.
And Stacey, that brings me to a question that I had for you, which is, I was interviewing a leader on this similar topic last week, and she said to me, I was impressed when we started talking about unconscious bias in the workplace. Now we're talking about systemic racism. She never thought that was going to happen. Are you encouraged by how the rhetoric has changed, and even in this space, working in this space for over a decade? Are you encouraged by how the rhetoric has changed, and why is it important for the rhetoric to change?
I think it's important, and I am encouraged because the racism is the underlying, right, of the work that we do. So before, when we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, it was a little bit more surface level, but that's because that was all the companies would take, right? That's all you could get out of a leader. And so it was like, okay, we'll take what we can get. Now we're at a place where understanding the actual reasons that we are where we are, right? Which is the systemic racism that's underlying that. And for some people, it's really hard for them to hear that. You say that and they say, oh, but I'm not a racist. And no one said you were. So if that is the default for you, you want to get frustrated and upset and go, well, I get angry letters from people who said, you called me a racist. I'm like, I don't even know who you are. I literally didn't. But if that's what you took away from what I said, then you probably need to do some inner work, right? And that's not about me, that's about you.
So in a sense, we're peeling back the onion with all these different rhetoric that we're using to describe what's really the inherent problem within corporate America. Stacey, I'm going to bring in a question that we have in the stream right now from Lori, who really is asking how this happens when the rubber meets the road and you're having conversations with your colleagues about this. She says, have you ever gone back to someone who was irritated by your honest feedback on a topic involving their unconscious bias? I find it important to give feedback on how I felt when they say what they said, what they did, even if it's uncomfortable. Thoughts on how to navigate giving feedback on this topic?
Definitely. Feedback is necessary, but it doesn't have to be done in the moment. So in most instances, people think like, oh, if somebody says something to me, if I'm, if a microaggression is sort of hurled my way, I have to if I don't catch it in a moment, then the moment's gone and that's it. And that's not true. You can come back to it. And it's possible to come back to it without coming off, angry or anything like that. And I always like to say that you can confront it without being confrontational. So if somebody has said something that you need to address, you can come back later and say, I heard what you said, and this is how it landed for me. I'd like to know what your actual intent was. And ask them, what did you really mean by that, right? What were you trying to convey? You give them the opportunity to explain themselves, because in many instances, people don't actually mean to be hurtful or to be derogatory. I'll give you the perfect example is people love to say to me, "Oh, Stacey, you speak so eloquently." And I have to keep telling them that is not a compliment. I know you think it's a compliment, but it's not. And let me tell you why. Because if I were a white woman, you would not come up to me and tell me that I speak so eloquently. You do it because I am a Black woman, and that is surprising to you that I speak so eloquently. And there is the bias.
And as I'm sure you've been giving that feedback throughout your career, is the response changing as these topics are discussed more openly at work?
Not really. I mean,
these are hard conversations. I'm seeing so many members in the stream saying, how do you actually do this? And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that it's always going to be uncomfortable, but it's through the work of those uncomfortable conversations that progress will be made.
Right. It's definitely, I would say that there's more openness to it, right? And that's why if everyone is doing it, then it makes it easier. This is why psychological safety is such an important concept. So, when we think about psychological safety, excuse me, Amy Edmondson coined that term. And if you watch her TED Talk, she talks about it. Psychological safety helps to create a space where it's okay for me to say that what you said was hurtful, that what you said was derogatory. And it creates a space for you to also then say, you know what, I didn't know that, and I apologize, and know that I'm not going to take it personally, right? But we can have a grown-up conversation. We are adults about this, and we can talk it through.
I think that's important to remember that we are mostly all adults in the workplace. Stacey, before I let you go, I want to bring up the poll results. I'm eager to see what the members in the stream have to say in terms of how they're thinking about unconscious bias and how it's showing up in their work. So I think we're going to bring those up right now. Okay, do you know what unconscious bias looks like in the workplace? 61%, Stacey, say yes, they do know what it looks like. We have comments from members like Adam saying, I'd like to think so, but if I was put to a set of test rigors, I could surely find some gaps along the way. 21% say no, they don't. And then we have 18% saying that they think so. Stacey, are those results surprising to you? Was that what you were thinking was going to show up in the poll?
It's not surprising because I think people understand what unconscious bias looks like, but I think that they would be surprised at some of the forms it takes. So we might know, like you said in the very beginning, that in my LinkedIn course on unconscious bias that I address all the different types. I want to say, no, I don't, because there's over 150. I think I address maybe 5 types of unconscious bias, right? So it shows up in so many different ways, and we know we'll identify some of them. And this is why it's important to talk about it. Because the more we talk about it, the more we understand what it looks like.
Well, Stacey, thank you for coming on LinkedIn News Live and discussing this important topic with us today. If you haven't checked out Stacey's LinkedIn Learning course, please be sure to do that, and also her book on bias. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
All right. Tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, I will be sitting down with the CEO of AT&T Business, Ann Chow, for a conversation on advancing women in technology, cultivating the next generation of leaders, and so much more. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.